Brian received a $500 fine for a rule that didn't even exist, just because HOA President Deborah Wilkins decided she could get away with it. Arrogant and untouchable, she had spent years bullying homeowners, crushing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. But this time, she messed with the wrong homeowner. Brian wasn't just going to fight back, he was going to expose everything. And when the truth finally came to light, the entire neighborhood watched as the mighty HOA crumbled before their eyes. When Brian bought his cozy suburban home, he never imagined that 2 years later, he'd be knee-deep in a legal nightmare. He wasn't the type to pick fights with the HOA, but he also wasn't the type to roll over and let bureaucratic nonsense trample his rights. So, when he opened his mailbox one evening and pulled out a $500 fine for violating some rule he'd never even heard of, alarm bells started ringing. "What the hell?" he muttered, unfolding the crisp white letter. "Violation of landscaping regulations. Unauthorized flowerbed installation." Flowerbed? What flowerbed? All Brian had done was plant a few rose bushes near his fence, a simple touch of greenery, nothing extravagant. Still gripping the letter, he stomped inside, dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, and grabbed the HOA handbook he had shoved in a drawer 2 years ago. Flipping through the pages, his frustration grew with each line. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it say that flower beds were against the rules. So why the fine? The answer hit him fast. Deborah Wilkins, president of the HOA, self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood order, a woman with an uncanny ability to make minor inconveniences feel like acts of treason against the homeowners association. She was the type who peeked through her blinds and took notes whenever someone's grass grew half an inch too long. The type who lived for writing passive-aggressive emails about holiday decorations and unauthorized trash can placement. And most importantly, the type who absolutely despised people who didn't bow to her self-imposed rule. Brian had seen her in action before, telling the Johnsons their mailbox was too modern-looking and forcing the Millers to repaint their front door because beige was a more harmonious community color than light gray. He just never thought he'd be next on her hit list. Grabbing his phone, he dialed the HOA office, his pulse ticking up a notch as he listened to the ringing tone. "Homeowners Association, this is Deborah Wilkins," came the voice, smooth, clipped, and soaked in condescension. "Yeah, hi, this is Brian Taylor. I just got a fine for a flower bed violation, which, by the way, isn't even a real rule in the handbook. Care to explain why I'm being charged $500 for something that isn't illegal?" A brief silence. Then, with obnoxious politeness, Deborah replied, Mr. Taylor, we at the HOA have discretionary authority to enforce community standards as we see fit." Brian blinked. "Discretionary authority? So you're telling me you fine me just because you can?" "We strive to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood," she continued, unfazed. "If you have an issue with the fine, you're welcome to submit an appeal. But rules are rules." "Except this isn't a rule," Brian shot back, his grip on the phone tightening. But she was already done with the conversation. "Have a great day, Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice dripping with smug finality, and then, click. Brian stared at the phone in disbelief. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was war. Brian wasn't about to roll over and hand the HOA $500 for a rule they just pulled out of thin air. He had every intention of fighting this, and the first step was filing an appeal. He sat down at his kitchen table that same night, cracking his knuckles before typing out the most airtight, logic-driven, undeniable argument he could muster. He laid out the facts. 1. Nowhere in the HOA handbook did it state that flower beds were prohibited. 2. Several homes in the neighborhood had flower beds, some even far more extravagant than his modest rose bushes. 3. If this was a rule, then why weren't other homeowners fined as well? To drive the point home, he attached photographic evidence, pictures of at least 5 other houses with similar, if not larger, flower beds. He even highlighted the exact section of the HOA guidelines where the so-called rule didn't exist. Satisfied, he printed the appeal, slid it into an envelope, and dropped it off at the HOA office the next morning. 3 days later, the response arrived. A thin, white envelope, crisp and professional looking, landed in his mailbox. He ripped it open, already expecting some half-assed excuse, but the sheer blatant arrogance of their response still managed to send his blood pressure through the roof. Your violation has been reviewed and confirmed. The fine remains in effect. Failure to pay immediately will result in additional sanctions. That was it. No explanation, no counterpoints, no mention of the evidence he had submitted. Just, we said so. So pay up. 3 minutes. That's how long it must have taken them to reject his appeal. He doubted they even read his argument. This wasn't about enforcing rules. This was about power and control. And now that Brian had dared to challenge their authority, they were digging in their heels. Fine. If they wanted to play hardball, he could play too. So he ignored the fine. Let them stew. A week later, a second envelope arrived. Thicker, more official looking. Brian already knew it wasn't going to be good news, but when he opened it, his jaw actually dropped. The new fine wasn't $500 anymore. It was $1,500. Failure to comply has resulted in additional fees and administrative costs. Payment due immediately. He let out an incredulous laugh. They were trying to intimidate him. They thought they could scare him into paying by inflating the penalties and threatening administrative consequences. It was a scam, plain and simple. And yet, Brian knew this tactic worked. The HOA wasn't stupid. They had perfected the art of bullying homeowners into submission. They start with a minor fine, something most people wouldn't fight over. Then, if you dare to push back, they jack up the penalties until it becomes a financial nightmare. Most people just cave under the pressure, afraid of making things worse. And that's exactly what they were banking on. The neighborhood had taken notice. People whispered as he walked by. A few gave him looks of pity, others of warning. HOA wars weren't new to this community, but they were rarely won. One afternoon, while retrieving his mail, Brian felt a presence behind him. "You're not the first," a voice murmured. He turned to see Mr. Davis, the elderly man from a few houses down, a quiet, reserved type, one of those longtime residents who had seen it all. Brian raised an eyebrow. "They've done this before?" Mr. Davis scoffed. "They do it all the time." His voice was low, cautious, as if he feared the walls had ears. "They did the same thing to me 5 years ago. First, it was a small fine, then more, then threats of legal action. I fought back for a while, but..." He let out a weary sigh. "In the end, I caved. They can take you to court if they want to, and they usually win." Brian absorbed that for a moment. "So they scare people into paying," he muttered. Mr. Davis nodded. "That's how they operate. If they think you won't fight back, they'll squeeze you dry. And even if you do fight back, they'll just drag you through hell until you give up." Brian exhaled slowly, staring at the HOA letter in his hands. Then he smirked. "Good," he said, tucking the letter into his pocket. "Let them take me to court." Brian wasn't the kind of man who backed down. Not now, not ever. If the HOA thought they could bully him into submission, they were dead wrong. He wasn't about to let a group of power-hungry suburban overlords bleed him dry over a made-up rule. So he did what any rational, pissed-off homeowner would do. He lawyered up. He found a local attorney, Mark Davidson, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who had handled HOA disputes before. The moment Brian sat down in his office and laid out the situation, Mark let out a low chuckle. "Oh, I love these cases," he said, leaning back in his chair. "HOAs think they're untouchable, but when you actually put them under a microscope..." He snapped his fingers. "They crumble," Brian grinned. "Then let's burn this whole thing to the ground." Mark smirked. "That's the spirit." And so they started digging. As it turned out, this wasn't the first time the HOA had pulled this stunt. Over the years, they had hit multiple homeowners with fines based on completely fabricated rules. Some paid up immediately, afraid of escalating the conflict. Others fought back and won. Brian tracked down 3 former residents who had been in his exact situation. Each of them had received a fine for violating rules that didn't exist. They had appealed, been denied within minutes, and eventually either paid or moved away to escape the HOA's grasp. But the best part, 2 of them had already sued the HOA and won. Mark went through the old case files and practically whistled. They got caught red-handed, fined, forced to return the money, even issued a public apology. He shook his head, tapping the documents. And yet here they are, pulling the same scam. Brian clenched his jaw. That was it. That was his case. Now he was ready for war. The day of the trial, Brian walked into the courthouse, calm, collected, and fully prepared. He wasn't alone. His lawyer stood beside him, briefcase in hand, while 3 other victims of the HOA scam sat behind him, ready to testify. Across the room, Deborah Wilkins sat stiff as a board, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked way less confident than she did. They still thought they had this in the bag. They thought they were untouchable. They were about to get a very rude awakening. The judge entered, and the case began. Deborah's lawyer spoke first, droning on about community standards and enforcing neighborhood harmony. He painted Brian as an uncooperative homeowner who simply refused to abide by the rules. And then, Mark stood up and nuked their entire case in under 5 minutes. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth and controlled, "the Homeowners Association fined my client for violating a rule that does not exist." Silence. Deborah's lawyer shifted in his seat. Mark stepped forward, holding up the HOA rulebook. "This is the official HOA handbook. Nowhere in these pages does it say that flower beds are prohibited." He let that sink in before walking directly to the judge's bench. "Here's where things get interesting. The HOA rejected my client's appeal within 3 minutes. No review, no explanation, just an immediate rejection." The judge raised an eyebrow. That got his attention. Mark continued, flipping a page in his notes. "We also have evidence that this isn't the first time they've done this. 2 previous homeowners successfully sued this HOA for fining them based on fabricated rules." That was the moment Deborah's confidence cracked. The judge turned to the HOA's lawyer. "Is this true?" The man fumbled for words. Well, these cases were settled out of court." Mark didn't let him off the hook, meaning the HOA admitted wrongdoing. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He already knew how this was going to end. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and gave his verdict. "This looks a lot like extortion, HOA. You are ordered to cancel the fine, compensate the defendant for legal fees, and return any other fines issued under similar circumstances." Brian had to physically stop himself from grinning like a lunatic. Deborah Wilkins looked like she had just swallowed a whole lemon. But Brian wasn't done yet. Not even close. Brian didn't just win. He utterly destroyed the HOA. What started as a petty $500 fine ended with the entire organization in shambles. When the judge slammed down the final ruling, it wasn't just about canceling the fine or covering his legal fees. Oh no, that was just the beginning. The court awarded Brian $5,000 in damages for the stress, harassment, and blatant abuse of power he had endured. But the real victory? Brian's case exposed everything. With the help of the other homeowners who had been wrongfully fined, Mark presented a damning pattern of corruption. The HOA had been running their scam for years, collecting thousands of dollars from terrified homeowners who didn't have the resources to fight back. Now, thanks to Brian, the truth was out. The judge's ruling sent a shockwave through the community. The HOA was ordered to return every single dollar they had illegally taken. Checks started arriving in mailboxes across the neighborhood, refunds for bogus fines that people had paid out of fear. And then came the final blow. Deborah Wilkins resigned, the woman who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, who had terrorized homeowners over trivial nonsense, who had smugly dismissed Brian's complaints like they were beneath her, was gone. She didn't even have the dignity to do it in person. A brief email announcement went out to all homeowners. "Effective immediately, I am stepping down as HOA president. It has been an honor serving this community." Honor? Brian almost choked on his coffee. She had spent years terrorizing this community, and now, the second she had to face real consequences, she ran. Good riddance. The neighborhood felt different after that, lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. People smiled more, walked with less tension, no longer afraid to step out of line. One evening, as Brian was coming back from a grocery run, he spotted Mr. Davis standing by his mailbox. The old man had been one of the first to warn him, to tell him that fighting the HOA was a losing battle. Now, he just looked at Brian with pure admiration. "You did what we were all too scared to do," Davis said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and disbelief. "You actually won." Brian chuckled, glancing at his infamous flower bed, still standing, untouched, exactly where it had been when this all started. He smirked. So, I guess roses are officially legal now? Davis let out a genuine laugh. For the first time in a long time, Brian felt something real, not just relief, not just satisfaction. True, undeniable victory.